Great. Well, thank you so much, Megan. If we have more questions, we'll get them out to you. And if you want to share anything about marine mammal studies and sound, it could go on our Padlet that we
I'll go on yeah, great. And I'll put links to any of the websites I mentioned, as well as some of the publications if you're interested as well too. I'll put those on lunch over on the board. Thank you for doing that. That's
You're
great.
getting a lot of appreciation. It's a very interesting topic and very timely. So really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. McKenna. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and hopefully I'm not going to mess up the pronunciation of your name, Rebecca. You can correct me if I do. Dr. Rebecca S. Duerr is a clinical veterinarian and research director at the International Bird Rescue's 2 wildlife clinics in California. After earning a BS in marine biology from San Francisco State University, she completed her DVM, MPVM, which I'm not exactly sure what that is, you'll have to tell us, and PhD degrees at UC Davis, with graduate work on the care of oiled common murres and on the nutritional energetics and physiology of common murres and western grebes. She serves on the board of directors of the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association and is a frequent speaker at avian and wildlife conferences. She enjoys sharing her enthusiasm for how incredibly cool and strange birds are with the world, and particularly loves repairing birds that have been injured by the unfortunate actions of humans. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Duerr.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, it's Duerr. Not that it matters. So thanks for inviting me to talk today. It's an interesting symposium I actually have not been involved in before, so thanks for expanding my world. So today I'm going to present you with some information about the recreational fishing gear injuries that we see in the seabirds of California. Although I actually should say aquatic birds, since we do deal with a lot of more terrestrial aquatic birds as well. Okay, so just a little background on International Bird Rescue. So this organization was founded in 1971 as an oil spill response agency. And for most of the 70s, 80s, 90s was the primary oil spill response organization that would deal with wildlife in California until the advent of the Oil Wildlife Care Network. And now we're a member of that and work with them. So currently, we have 2 year-round wildlife centers where we actually occupy 2 of the primary care centers of the OWCN for ordinary wildlife rehabilitation on a daily basis year-round. We typically deal with 2,000 to 4,000 non-oiled birds a year, and we have about 20 staff and a whole lot of volunteers. So we have these 2 primary care centers located in Fairfield in the San Francisco Bay Area and in San Pedro down by the harbor in Los Angeles. We also operate a turnkey oil spill facility in Anchorage, Alaska in case of oil spills up there. So in the greater San Francisco Bay Area, we act as a kind of like a referral hospital for the other wildlife rehabilitation centers. We essentially take their cases that require specialized housing or veterinary care where they don't have access to that. So all of these organizations in the broader Bay Area transfer animals to us. We also get animals from inland as well, as far as the Sierras. We occasionally get brown pelicans from places like the Grand Canyon. We get brown boobies from Anchorage, Alaska. I mean, we get birds shipped to us from all over the place. But this is the primary areas that we receive animals from. So kind of like if your dog needed to go to a neurologist, you might be referred to a specialty practice. So we're that for aquatic birds for these other wildlife centers. Okay, so down in Los Angeles, situation's a little bit different. So the organizations spanning from Santa Barbara Wildlife Care Network, who recently hired their own veterinarians, so we're now receiving a little bit fewer animals from them. But we also receive animals from more than 35 different animal controls from throughout the Los Angeles basin. It's a pretty intense bunch of different organizations that give us animals, plus the public, of course, at both centers. So the reasons that we get animals include all sorts of things. Of course, we see a lot of orphaned animals, you know, abandoned, kidnapped, whatever, tons of mallard, ducklings, etc. But our other animals that we get, lots of car hit animals, lots of animals that are stranding due to perhaps prey situations out in the ocean. That certainly can happen. Adverse weather events can lead to a lot of runoff, and then we'll end up with a whole lot of contaminated animals that are just grungy and not waterproof anymore. So all sorts of things happen to bring us animals. But in particular, today I just wanted to focus on the category of the fishing hook and line injuries that we receive. I generally am only counting things as fishing hook and line gear injuries if they have either the gear on them when they come in the door, or if they have very specific types of injuries that, you know, 99% likely to be fishing hook line injuries. But there are a whole lot of other animals with unknown traumas that are probably also fishing hook and line injuries. That category ends up being even a little larger than the known fish hook and line injuries. So as an example of what we get, this is our everyday type of thing. So these pictures were texted to me yesterday by one of our main blue-banded pelican spotters who kayaks Pillar Point Harbor fairly frequently, Bart Selby. So these pelicans are out in Pillar Point probably today. This bird has my least favorite type of fishing gear in the world on his leg, and his leg is probably really screwed up. So it looks like there's a triple hook above the bird's hawk. His hawk looks infected. He's got other hooks kind of crumpling his whole leg together. So pelicans are a big, heavy bird. They don't do well with one leg. Birds that are missing a leg don't generally get seen more than once or twice. And this next bird, also out in the harbor currently, has is unable to stand on that leg and has a very large sinker hanging on it. So these are birds that, if they could be rescued, we would certainly be treating. If the bird is capturable, Bart does pester the yacht harbor folks to go help him catch stuff out on. But a lot of times these are on the breakwaters, and you know, there's the possibility of spooking all the birds if you go out there and disrupt a whole bunch of them. So it can be quite difficult to capture these animals when they're still flighted. Here's another one he spotted yesterday. So this one has a line around his wing, but he's still flighted. So this would be a very difficult animal to catch. But meanwhile, unknown things are happening with that. You know, if the animal is not being punctured and getting infected with a gross fish hook poking through his flesh and wrecking tissue, if it's a mere line entanglement and the bird's still flighted, you may be able to get that off eventually through preening. But a lot of times the monofilament is anchored on the bird with a hook in them. This is a bird that I rescued myself with one of my staff members right before I went home from work last night. This bird was down below the DoubleTree Hotel in the Rip Rap in the Long Beach Harbor by San Pedro. So this bird is a very typical bird that we get with recreational gear on them. So what these are is apparently bait fish hooks. So there are a lot of little tiny hooks, and unfortunately there's usually a bunch of them, like 6 or 10 on a single monofilament, and they can end up mummifying the bird. I guess they're called sabiki rigs. I am not an expert on fishing gear by any stretch of the imagination. But the best speculation I have heard for how these birds get these sorts of gear on them is if the bird is feeding in a bait ball, or there's some feeder fish down there and the birds are foraging and people are casting these into the area where the fish are, and they're catching a bird and then cutting them loose, and then the bird wanders off with the entanglement and hooks in them, and things just go downhill from there. And if they're lucky, they don't drown and get to shore and get rescued. This particular bird had 4 hooks. One is penetrating the tendons at the back of his tarsometatarsus here, the lower leg bone. There's another hook right above his hock joint, but his most serious injury actually is entanglement injury that's hiding under the feathers here. That is probably the most likely to be life-threatening. Once we got the gear off, the bird was able to stand up, but I have some serious concern over the health of the tendons on the front of his leg. So we'll see how that goes. It's not all about pelicans, but we do tend to use them as the most charismatic megafauna of our local birds. So we do see lots of other species getting these sorts of injuries. So this is a whimbrel. So this is a bird from this past summer where why a whimbrel ate a hook, I don't know. Must have had something tasty on it. I was able to successfully get this hook out, and that bird was released. I've never done that sort of thing on a whimbrel before, so something new every day. Okay, so this is about a year's worth of the gear that we've taken off birds just at our Los Angeles center. At our Bay Area center, a lot of times the gear has been removed already by these other wildlife centers, so we don't usually get it to collect it in a happy, gross pile of nastiness. But the Los Angeles center gets a lot more birds straight off the beach, so we accumulate some stuff. Looking down the top of that thing, so there's a bunch of these in there. I hate these things. Can we get these banned? I would really like that. That would make me so happy. These are like a really mean thing for wildlife because they look like a fish, but they've got 2 or 3 death traps on them. So these triple hooks that hang off of different spots on the lure generally entangle more than one body part. So there'll be the bill, the bird, if they try to take one of these off their leg, they might catch their face. So then they have their face stuck to their leg. I had a nasty one of these once where one end of one of these things was literally poking into the bird's temporomandibular joint at his jaw, rendering that as an open joint. And the other end of the stupid lure was literally in his wrist joint. There's not a lot that we can do when things are like that. And unfortunately, these evil lures tend to lodge in the animal's joints a lot of the time. Colleen, I think, is on this meeting. She rescued a bird with one of these once. We did end up releasing that bird. I have a gross picture from it later. Okay, so we do see kind of a lot of animals overall. So here's our general intake information from the last 18 years since the advent of our electronic databases, which are still a work in progress. But as you can see, the fishing hook and line injury animals on here are a relatively small percentage, kind of varies a little bit, but there's been a lot of erratic data collection here. And we switched from various databases to what we currently use is a much better custom database that is specifically designed for us, that captures information much better since 2016. So there undoubtedly these are minimum numbers again, especially in the long ago past. So anyway, that's kind of a proportion. So up to about a quarter of our caseload right now is this type of injury. So here's what we see. So here's a typical patient, another brown pelican. We do see a lot of them. And they were only delisted in 2009, and we do still treat each individual like it's gold. So they do get the best possible care that we can do for them. So this is what happens when flesh is entangled in these birds. So there is dead skin that has been constricted on the bird's leg, and then fluid starts to build up upstream of that towards the body. So this is all swollen. As you may or may not know, the dead skin, when it's on an animal, this is adhered to the bone here in the front, and then it's probably adhered to the tendons at the back of the leg here. There also is one of these deep constriction wounds above the hock. Those also can be serious problems for the bird. Dead tissue is usually infused with bacteria and is a lovely route for bacteria to enter the body. So these things usually become infected. So once the dead tissue has been removed, eventually it'll slough off on its own if the bird isn't dying of an infection. So what you see here are some exposed tendons, some exposed bone. One thing that we try to do in our care of these animals is maintain the health of their tendons so that they can end up having functional limbs, because that definitely drives whether they're going to be releasable. And then here's this bird here. So this bird's currently in care at our San Francisco Center. One of the problems with pelicans as well, and when they get these leg injuries, is that they start to not be able to control their toes very well. And if they're standing on their back toe, if it gets folded under the foot, a lot of times it'll kill the toe and can end up having to amputate the toe. But meanwhile, these animals are very labor intensive to treat because a lot of times they have injuries on multiple body parts and require a lot of bandage changes. Okay, so overall, here's kind of what we see. So this is a minimum number again, especially for animals that were from the long ago past. It's probably an undercount of the number of fishing hook and line injury cases that we have in our database. So brown pelicans and western gulls definitely are the bulk of the cases, but we see a broad swath of other species with problems. Yeah, fair number. The American white pelicans are often extremely badly injured, but we do pull some of them through their problems too. Who else? We see fair number of loons and grebes and all sorts of species with these injuries. Adult black-crowned night herons are a common animal that we see like this. So pretty much anybody who's ever around an aquatic environment is at risk of getting some hooks in them. And usually they are lodged in body parts that I can't really explain very well with the animal getting derelict gear. So most of these animals get this sort of gear that is from active fishing. So this is what it does to a Canada goose. I suppose if it's on the legs, it certainly could be from derelict gear. But a lot of times there's a hook lodged further up on the bird's body that is causing the line to drape around, and then it gets wrapped around and constricts the limb. So these sorts of constriction injuries are among the worst. They usually form essentially a tourniquet around the leg. And one of the weird things that just blows me away, even still, knowing what I know about anatomy and physiology in birds, is that they can have blood supply to their and nerve function to their foot when their bones are doing this. And practically the limb is getting cut off. Like there is still blood supply past this hideous constriction wound that's exposing bone and cutting into tendons. And they'll keep walking on that thing till their leg falls off. I've only ever had one break in my hand once, but that was a horrifying PTSD generating experience. So sometimes now when we're treating these, we do put a splint on them just to keep them stable. Anyway. So stranding locations, where do we get these animals from? In the Bay Area, the main wharf in Santa Cruz is a horrible hotspot. The whole waterfront in Santa Cruz, also Aptos and Capitola, all those areas are a problem. We also do receive a fair amount from the coasts of San Francisco Peninsula and inside the Bay. Some of the Marin County areas, a surprising amount of common murres that are entangled wash up at Stinson Beach. What else is a hot spot there? A lot of the public fishing piers within San Francisco Bay provide us with quite a few animals. Down in Monterey, of course, the city itself, plus I did include Moss Landing there with Monterey. Not with Santa Cruz. So Santa Cruz is a huge hotspot all by itself. So this common murre photo up here, that's a bird that Bart Selby took a picture of out in Pillar Point again, common murre. And western gulls, this bird came in for care twice. So once as a youngster where he had a infected foot from fishing hook punctures. I ended up amputating a toe, and then we banned all our birds. So this bird came back a little more than a year later with ingested fish hooks, and he had surgery again and got released. I at least got to see that his feet looked fine, being short a toe. I'm always flying blind on what I can cut off a bird. So in the Los Angeles area, we get so many from those animal control agencies. I mean, from Downey and Compton and, you know, downtown LA. We once had animal control drive up with a brown booby in the animal control vehicle that they picked up wandering around in the streets of downtown Los Angeles. That sort of thing happens in LA. The super hot spot down in the Los Angeles area, though, is the Redondo Beach fishing pier. I went out there to see it myself not too long ago, and man, there are hundreds of people just line, just in a row. It's quite spectacular how many people are fishing off that thing. And there's a breakwater there now where we have one of our volunteers that's kayaking and spotting lots of our blue-banded birds there. So we do actually have a bird that hangs out at the Redondo Beach Pier annually for the last more than 10 years and never's been entangled. So I guess there are some pelicans that are very smart. We do receive a lot of animals from Santa Barbara. So pretty much anywhere with a public fishing pier is a super high risk area. The Cabrillo Beach area in San Pedro near our center is a big problem, as is many of the fishing piers along the Long Beach area coast. So pier fishing may be free to fishers, but it is not to the birds. Oh my gosh. It causes so much pain, suffering, disability, and death. And it's certainly not free to us either. So I did a little cost estimate here. So we have kind of a basic, you know, cost per day on the birds that we treat. So this is the kind of funding that we're throwing into treating these animals. Plus, we have about 30,000 volunteer hours a year treating these animals. So I'm going to show you some graphic pictures. I hope you can handle it. Just be warned. Just thought that everybody ought to be able to see what does the gear do to the animal. So I already mentioned these guys, but this is that bird that had that temporomandibular joint laid open by a hook with the other one in his wrist joint. So they puncture often into bones and joints. And when people cut these animals free, they can end up with horrible abscesses. Hooks stab into the bone in their mouths. It can be pretty bad. This is Colleen's bird that she rescued from Moss Landing with one of those double treble hook beastly fishing lures in its leg. So this bird actually did get released and was recited thereafter. It had 7 surgeries and a whole lot of stuff happened to it to get it to a releasable state. But it was recited on Nuevo Island about a year after release. These entanglement things and punctures are just awful. Fish hooks mostly ruin joints when they pass through them. If it's a toe, maybe I can chop it off, amputate it. Entanglement immobility causes horrible pressure sores. So if the animal is mummified in fishing line and hauled out on a rock, they end up with tissue necrosis on the part of their body that is hitting the rock. That could be a life ender. Lots and lots of fish hooks, rip tissues. I do a lot of pouch surgeries on pelicans. Another thing people don't really think about with monofilament is that it actually can cut like a knife, which is kind of an odd thing. These can be some really challenging injuries to treat. And then this is a different bird than the one I rescued last night, but with still a similar gear on it. Probably the constriction injuries, though, are definitely the worst, and these can go any direction. Ingestion, oddly, is sometimes less bad than a lot of these external injuries that we see with these animals. For some reason, the fishing gear, recreational fishing gear in California doesn't seem to include a lot of lead, like hallelujah. So we aren't dealing concurrently with lead toxicity in these animals very much. Every now and then, but not very often. So we can often fix them if they are brought into care, but first they have to survive to get out of the water, not drown, and they need to become debilitated enough to not be flying around and have someone catch them. So I can only assume that there's a huge chunk of animals that are just dying. So here's a case of mine. This one actually might be a different type of disturbance in that I think there's somebody down in Southern California who's slashing pelican pouches. This is the 4th case like this I've had in the last 2 years. Marina del Rey and Ventura, 2 cases each. So this bird was repaired, released, took about 4 to 6 weeks. I forget how long he was in care, and then resighted, woohoo, a year later. Thanks to his blue band, we can see who he is, perched, I think he was at Shell Beach, of the San Luis area, almost a year later, which is cool. So we do blue band these birds as much as possible. So here's a kind of a chart of our blue band history. And I thought you might be interested to see what % of the birds that we get are released. This is just pelicans. So the number of pelicans we've received in any of these particular years. When we first started applying the blue auxiliary bands to birds in late 2009, right when they were delisted, we didn't have very many blue bands, and then we promptly got swamped with adult pelicans during a big crash that winter. So we were only able to apply a little more than 100 of the blue bands, but there were 400 and some birds that got released. So as you can see, our % released varies fairly widely from about 40% to 50 something. But the kind of low numbers of pelicans we've been receiving recently are largely fishing line injury birds. That's kind of our staple pelican, and we release about half of those. And considering how horrible their wounds are, 50% is fine. I'm okay with that. So we've applied a little more than 1,400 blue bands, and we've had, I think, 667 of those individuals resighted after release. There also have been 37 of those guys that have gone through rehab 42 extra times. So if we weren't banding them, we would have thought they were 42 different extra birds. Here's some of our data on resightings that we have, thanks to our banding program. So I separated out the alive resightings versus the dead resightings, since I feel weird combining those. So in the long ago past, when we only had metal bands on the birds, they were definitely more likely to have dead resightings, since you can't really read the bands all that well, unless they're in your hand. But since 2009, when we started doing the blue bands, where I have this little blue bracket over here, it's definitely shunted up our live sightings dramatically, which is really cool because I love following these guys after they release. And you might notice this, the angled slope here from 2010 down to 2018 is largely represents not enough time has passed for there to be more sightings passed to the right of that diagonal. So the green background is then the longest record that we have from birds that were banded during those time periods. So they seem to do pretty well. And we have mostly live sightings. Okay, and since we're kind of Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary here, focused in some ways, I thought I'd include this information. So this is these sightings are a year out of date, but only a year. So I put this together for the scientific advisory committees of the Gulf of the Farallones and Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuaries. So these, the x-axis is representing the blue banded pelicans that we received from the sanctuaries during these time periods that were banded and released, and then what the resightings are from those birds. And there's a little X at the top of each column that was a fishing line injury. So you can kind of see that those you know, once an animal gets released, it seems to do about as well as an animal that was rehabilitated for another reason. But all the animals have to meet the same release criteria in order to get out the door. So that makes some sense. So yeah, they do pretty well. I love seeing these guys alive in the wild after we've done stuff to them. Okay, so just a couple quick cases of what we often treat. So this was a really bad constriction injury from 2017. This bird's foot came in as a purple balloon from a constriction wound above the hock, and also had a really severe patagium injury too. And so I ended up having to amputate the dead parts of the foot. Bird was in care for a very long time. However, it was also during fires when we ended up evacuating our centers. So all of our train wreck bird cases ended up getting transferred over to wild care in Marin, and then came back to us when we went back to our facility. However, this bird was released in January 2018. So we got a blue band X48, and then was seen almost a year later in December in Half Moon Bay. Bart Selby is our kayak person out there who spots blue-banded pelicans for us. And he has a list on his kayak of what birds I want close-ups of their feet. So he takes foot shots for me of birds that I've done strange surgeries to. I can't see the foot all that well, but I can see that the bird is standing very nicely, fully weight-bearing on that foot, and the other foot looks lovely. And then he got seen again in April 2020. So I was so excited. Okay, and then that's all I have today. I have a wealth of data, and we're kind of working through it as we go and trying to get some of this stuff published. And thank you for your attention. And we also, you know, I've been working with Bart and the scientific advisory committees for the marine sanctuaries and trying to figure out how can we solve this problem. Some of the recreational fishing piers end up being kind of in like a odd position regulation wise. So happy to talk to anybody about any of these solving these problems. So that's all I got.
Thank you. You're getting some really great comments. It says, thank you, Dr. Becky. Thank you for all your efforts. Thank you for what you do for our fine feathered friends. I have a few questions for you.
Sure.
Adam asks, is monofilament line much more harmful to birds than braided line?
Oh, you know, I don't think that we have actually had a comparison for that. You know, a lot of them, other than at our LA center, a lot of the material has been removed already, so I don't really have that information. If somebody was interested in doing a study on that, I'm sure a lot of the wildlife rehab groups would be interested in participating. So.
Awesome, thank you. And then Lillian says, thank you for helping birds survive these hideous injuries. What do you recommend, short of closing public piers to fishing? If hooks had self-destruct devices, is there a critical time frame you could recommend? And if line were biodegradable, what would be the timeline to make a meaningful difference for these animals? I guess my question is whether you think degradable gear is an option to pursue, or is prevention really the only realistic option?
Well, if you're talking derelict gear, sure, degradable would be fabulous. But you know, once a bird has a constriction injury, if something's wrapping around that leg, you know, it's hours to days with the important time period. You know, you're cutting the blood supply off to a limb, cutting into the tissues. You know, unless it falls apart in a time frame where you couldn't catch fish with it, it probably wouldn't be very useful. Other than that, you know, it's difficult because these animals, when they get hooked, how do you get fishermen to not cut them off? Like ultimately, it would be better to reel them in and remove the gear and send them for medical care. We have a very robust wildlife rehabilitation network in California, so that is a possibility. Like there needs to be a lifeguard at each public fishing pier or something like that could work. You know, we end up with every individual animal control and every wildlife center kind of fending for themselves in trying to field these problems. But I would love to see places like Redondo Pier and Santa Cruz Pier, Stearns Wharf at Santa Barbara having a lifeguard out there monitoring people doing fishing. If anybody has great ideas, let me know. You know, we're essentially a nonprofit hospital dealing with the animals, you know, and I'm mostly a surgeon, so it's, you know, it's not like I'm a biologist out making signage for public piers. I'm sure a lot of that would be helpful as well.
Thank you. Any idea why Santa Cruz is such a hot spot, and have you seen many injuries caused by the braided spectra line?
Yeah, again, I don't know about the braided line, but as for Santa Cruz, I saw Laird was on the call. Maybe Laird and Colleen are in Santa Cruz can answer that question.
This is Colleen's question.
Oh, you tell me, you live there.
I know. We'll
What's the deal?
We have a comment from Sharon that's really interesting. She says, in San Luis Obispo County in 2020, Pacific Wildlife Care has accepted 3 times the number of fishing injured birds during the same period of 2019, mostly brown pelicans. Please pick up any fishing line or hooks or gear you see loose. I've trained my dog to sniff it out. I think that's brilliant.
Ooh, I took a fish out of a dog
Nice.
once.
Yeah, yeah. Jenna says it sounds dangerous. She's not risking Harry. And then we have a question. Please tell us how we can support you.
Oh, well, we're a nonprofit. So we certainly can, we have website stuff you could follow. We have donation campaigns we do online. We have all the usual stuff that nonprofits do. And I would agree with Pacific Wildlife Care. We definitely, it does seem like more people have been fishing during the pandemic. We have been seeing an uptick in that this year as well.
Yeah, I think sales of kayaks, paddleboards, fishing gear, boats are like way up out of all things. Azul says, what about some public advertisement for those fishermen about their responsibility? That's a great comment. And then Monica says, any idea how many, if any, reports come from fishermen?
Every now and then, we even had a couple of fishermen come rescue some pelicans that were offshore of San Pedro. That was very nice of them. They were out there in their boat and spotted a bird with a problem. So it does happen. Some of them are doing a good job.
Thank you. And then Claire says, NOAA has started a campaign to teach people what to do if they catch sea turtles. I like your idea of a knowledgeable lifeguard at a pier, but could a similar what to do with a hook bird campaign be beneficial?
It sure could. I know U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a lot of times has stuff that I've seen published where they actually tell people to cut them loose, which is like, oh, not my medical advice. Yeah, but what people should do is great, and it would kind of need to be locally oriented in who to contact to get an animal some care. One of the things I think people don't understand is even if you catch and release in birds, doesn't really work very well because they tend to get abscesses or they got poked in a joint or something awful happened. One of the frustrating things for me when other wildlife centers send us animals, a lot of times they'll say they took out a hook, but they won't tell me where, and then we're on abscess watch for the whole animal. Like, where is it going to come up?
Oh.
Yeah.
I see Jen and Laird. Jen mentioned something for the Refugio project. Their part of their restoration plan is to deal with this issue at piers.
Wonderful.
For brown pelicans. And then Laird says that there's lots of people fishing in Santa Cruz, so that's one of the reasons. And then Lisa Utal says the Santa Cruz Wharf is the longest one out into the sanctuary on the West Coast, and free fishing is year-round. Perhaps the number of birds that rest and nest here leads to the high numbers impacted. There's lots of shore fishing too, lots of access points, question mark. Wendy and Jeff say, could signs be placed on the piers to inform people who are fishing what to do if they hook a bird and a contact number? Yep. Sounds like
Who
a
wants
great
to
idea.
do that?
That's right. Yeah. Great. Well, I think that we need to get on so we can get out to lunch. If you, Rebecca, would put your information, so if people do want to help, in the either on the Padlet or in the chat for IBR, that would be fantastic. And thank you so much for your presentation.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duerr. We'll get it right at some point, probably when we're all done with the presentations. Thank you so much. That was a really informative, if not disturbing, presentation. And we wanted to kind of counterbalance that with our next talk, which we'll cover one particular program that has the goal of trying to mitigate this problem. And we're gonna hear from Paul Hobi about that. Paul manages the Seabird Protection Network's efforts to reduce disturbances to sensitive seabird colonies while using targeted outreach. Previous to Greater Farallones Association, he led grassroots outreach for the Marine Protected Area Collaborative Network and Ocean Conservancy. So Paul, give us a little hopeful information about the Reel In and Recycle program.
Sure. So thank you so much. Can you all hear me and see my screen, I hope? I've had some challenges presenting over Zoom, but I see a yes. So first of all, thank you so much to Dr. Rebecca Duerr for doing the very difficult work that she has done. I know it was very difficult for me to see a lot of those photos, and I've seen them before. And so, I want to tell you all a little bit about what the Seabird Protection Network is doing to help encourage recycling of monofilament line, and also identify some of the challenges with it, right? I'm Paul Hobi. I'm Program Manager of Seabird Protection Network. Seabird Protection Network is a program that is hosted at the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, and it's a collaborative of all the organizations that you see below. While I'm at it, I'd like to thank Gina and Cara for organizing the symposium and for inviting us to present. And I also need to thank the Command and Lubbock Oil Spill Trustee Councils that have funded the Seabird Protection Network, as well as our specific efforts to encourage recycling of monofilament line. So our program goal is to address human disturbance to breeding seabird colonies to enhance their recovery. We work between Point Reyes and Point Sur, and we believe that if you want to protect the species, you need to protect the places where they breed, right? So breeding seabird colonies are really our focus. And to accomplish that, we use outreach and education to targeted user groups, including boaters and fishermen. So our boater outreach program seeks to meet boaters where they are with presentations, presence at events, on the docks, and in harbors. We have placed signage throughout the Central Coast region, posters at tackle shops, dive shops, West Marines across the region. These all incorporate an entanglement message that says avoid harm, put fishing line in the trash, cover bait, and use barbless hooks or artificial lures. And we've distributed lots of products, including tide books, which are a great way to reach boaters and fishermen. We have big tide books, we have little tide books. They both incorporate entanglement messaging. And we also have an e-newsletter that I'd encourage you all to sign up for at the below link that goes directly to boaters. It's called the Monthly Drifter. And so really, I want to focus on our efforts to create partnerships to recycle fishing line under a program called Reel In and Recycle. Starting in 2016, we began efforts to install these fishing line recycling stations on boats and on docks. The program relies heavily on partnerships in the fishing community. So here you can see Ralph and Rudy of the Bolinas Rod and Boat Club installing one of two receptacles that they requested in Bolinas. I strongly believe that this issue requires strong involvement from the recreational fishing community. And Reel In and Recycle is definitely part of the solution. What we do is provide funding to install the receptacles. We purchase the receptacles themselves. We train our partners on how to manage them. And then it's up to them to collect and mail in the line for recycling. They mail it to Berkeley Sport Fishing, who melts the line down. They turn it into tackle boxes and other fishing related things. And, they make sure it stays out of the marine environment. And fishing line recycling is so important because even if you are throwing line in the trash, well, what happens then, right? It can it will end up in the landfill where it can end up entangling a bird that comes across it. So, this program is a partnership with the California Department of Boating and Waterways in California. It's part of a national program under the Boat.us Foundation that covers inland waterways as well. And since 1990, over 9 million miles of line have been recycled, which is quite a lot. Our specific contribution has been to expand the program into locations where coastal fishing is happening, including on fishing vessels at harbors, piers, and tackle shops. So these are a few of our partners prior to 2019. These are new partners that we have recently added. And again, our focus is really on coastal locations to help keep line out of the marine environment. These are some of our partners. Fish Emeryville is the largest sport fishing fleet north of Port Hueneme. You'll see the Berkeley Marina, harbor masters are excited about participating in this program. The Pacifica Municipal Pier, there are fishing line recycling stations at many fishing piers throughout California. And fishermen are enthusiastic about the program, and it really builds on the fishing community's conservation ethic and helps promote sustainable fishing, which are things that certainly professionals in the fishing industry really care about. Like these boat captains are guys that will double back to pick a plastic water bottle out of the ocean if they see it. They encourage fishing line recycling aboard their vessels and at the docks. Statewide, there are hundreds of recycling stations. Many of these were placed by the Department of Boating and Waterways. You can see a map and a list of these stations at the link below, or by Googling Reel In and Recycle and California Department of Boating and Waterways. Nevertheless, there are many entanglements that still occur. I want to identify some challenges associated with this program. First, line recycling does not address snagged gear. Snagged gear and recycling are related problems, but they're separate. I'm a fisherman, not a very good one, and when I snag a lure on a branch or a rock, I'll try to shake it free. I'll sometimes wait out to remove it if I can, but oftentimes, I'll break the line and the lure stays where it is. And this is a common practice amongst recreational fishing. I think this is the root of a lot of entanglement problems that we're seeing. And it is a tricky one to address because you're really talking about changing a widespread behavior. A second challenge associated with the program is that it only recycles monofilament line. We heard a question about braided line earlier. That is really common on sport fishing boats. Participants in our program have told us that they almost always use braided line and they don't really know what to do with it. And finally, maintaining these fishing line recycling partnerships is challenging, right? And requires capacity. So, this is how I feel like people are going to answer the phone when I call them to ask how their line recycling is going. And sometimes, if I call at the right time of the day, that is how they answer the phone. But other times, this is how they actually answer the phone. Sport fishing captains think that it's a potential client on the other line, and really it's Paul Hobi calling to ask about fishing line recycling. So, you need organizational capacity to maintain these partnerships, to make sure that partners are still collecting line, weighing it, and mailing it into Berkeley for recycling. And that all takes capacity. A second challenge is how to quantify the impact of the program on actually reducing entanglement. Like we can say we've collected 90 million miles of line that have been recycled, and that does mean that we've kept the line out of the water, but it's tough to translate that to a reduction in entanglement. So I also have a few quick recommendations for the program moving forward. First, I think it would pay off to research fishermen's behavior towards snagged gear. I'll maintain that it's a widespread practice to attempt to unsnag your gear, snap it off, and then leave it where it is. There are snag removal tools available from tackle shops. This photo is kind of hard to see, but it's one of these in action. But why aren't people using them? And I think the answer to that question would come from some aggressive stakeholder interviews amongst recreational fishermen, tackle shop owners, and boat captains. My second recommendation is to look into coordinating fishing line recycling with the recovery of snagged and derelict gear. I'm not an expert on derelict gear. In the past, CDFW, the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, the NOAA Marine Debris Program, and others have partnered to remove derelict gear off the California coast. A lot of times this is commercial gear like these crab pots. Currently, the Dungeness Crab Task Force is really involved in finding and removing lost crab pots from the ocean to reduce the risk of entanglement with whales. And you know, although many times these have focused on commercial gear, these are encouraging examples of fishermen that are leading efforts to remove gear from the ocean with a lot of support from the public sector. Reel in and recycling partnerships could be an ideal springboard to expand these efforts to recreational fishing and to help address the full scope of the problem. But this is something that will require a lot of external support. I do want to say quickly that regarding Santa Cruz, I know that the city, in partnership with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, has in the past closed the fishing pier and removed lures from the pier after lots of entanglements. And so, you know, there are encouraging examples out there of fishermen working with the state and other organizations to help remove gear from the